Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Big Questions, Small Steps. My name is Amanda and I'm so glad that you could join me today. Today we're going to talk about a rather personal topic. We're going to talk about the three main reasons why people aren't going to church anymore. And by church I mean the Christian church. Why are people not attending as frequently? Let's check it out. So today we're going to talk about why people are leaving the church. Now, keep in mind that the examples that I'm going to give and the topics that I'm going to speak to, this is all just coming from me and my opinion. I am not perfect. I do not have all the answers. I have not been in every church in the entire country nor the world. So this is just my experience based on what I viewed over the past 40 years of being part of the Christian church and things that I've thought of since leaving. Okay, so in my opinion, there are three main reasons that people aren't going to church anymore. And when I talk of church, again, I'm talking about the Christian church. And those three reasons are judgment, changes in priorities, and lack of connection. Those are the three things that I personally view as the cornerstones as to why people are not going to church anymore. So let's take them one by one, and I'll share my experiences along the way. Okay, so first off is judgment. In my 40 years being in the Christian church, I have seen firsthand many people who claim to be Christian, being good and faithful servants, and in the next moment or in the next breath, they say some of the nastiest things about people behind their back. It was a running joke when I was teaching confirmation that some of the most Christian people during service have the most unchristian attitudes the moment they leave. I worked at a grocery store and it always baffled me if I was working on a Sunday and people would come in to get groceries after service, how different they were personality-wise, how they treated each other with less kindness and more hostility and thinking that things were just owed to them. It was startling back then, but I took it as, oh, they're just having a bad day and trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. Now jump ahead to my parents actually left my hometown church and they came back to visit, and the judgment that I saw them have to endure hurt. They had been a part of this church before I was even born and very active. They moved out of town and came back for a Sunday service, and they were treated less than a second-class citizen. There were people wondering why they were there, and they thought they were too good for the church now, and why did they move out of the town? And it was awkward. There was all this judgment. Even if you came to service in a new outfit that was a little more loud in color, not like it had squeaky horns on it, but it was more loud in color, there would be people who would look at you and just they would give this impression that your mere appearance was not good enough. It makes complete sense to me. Why would someone want to endure that? Why would someone give up time to subject themselves to judgment by people who are supposed to be there to support you? It baffles me. It baffles me. Then switching positions, when I was teaching in Sunday school, there happened to be some children who had divorced families. So some weeks they would be there and some weeks they would not because they were at different parents or they had different activities or whatever. The judgment and the ridicule that I heard about these children from other teachers and from other family members of other kids in the class, it was so unchristian. All those little accusations of, oh, well, they're their priorities, or, oh yeah, the dad won't come to this church because he's too good for us, or it baffles my mind that people need to constantly push each other down. You can't just appreciate the people who are there for that reason. You need to demonstrate that you are better than them in some reason, in some way, that you are more Christian because you're more active. It doesn't make sense to me. Jump again to when I was fortunate enough to take some confirmation students to other worship spaces. There was pushback from our own church. They didn't want the kids going out and learning about these other places because they might get confused and maybe they will choose to go there instead. Okay, because you would rather have people brainwashed and stay there and never think for themselves? There's not a reason necessarily that you think that after people are confirmed, they tend to leave the church anyways. It's very short-sighted in my personal opinion. And even the way that people judge each other based on their denomination. Oh, you're Lutheran? Oh, you can't come with us because you're Baptist? There's a hierarchy in some of the religions. Now, just to point out, many will say, oh no, we don't have that. We accept all. We love all. We see their similarities. That is true to a certain degree. But it is also true that there is still judgment and bias when you think of all the different denominations. The Episcopals and the Methodist, for example, have many of the same traits. The one differing one is where they view the purpose of your connection. Like, are you going to worship for yourself and having that personal connection with God? Or are you going to worship to experience it and fulfill the promises through worship? Are you looking for a personal connection? That's different. There's differences and there's slight judgments in tone when you're like, oh, they say the Lutheran version of the prayer. Or even if you're attending a worship service and you cannot receive communion because, oh, you're not Catholic. I understand that there are certain principles that each denomination wants to uphold, and they want to make sure that if you're participating, that you have that same level. But it's very judgmental in some regards and very exclusive to give off the appearance of, oh, well, you're not one of us, so you can't participate in this. All that judgment. People face judgment on a daily basis in their life. In school, in work, at the grocery store for what you're buying. Heaven forbid you're buying diapers and a bottle of wine in the same trip. I guarantee you that the cashier is likely going to think something. And it's not just, okay, I have break in 5 minutes. When I was a cashier, there would be times where people would check out and I would make judgments, whether they were using a WIC check, whether they were using SNAP or EBT, whether they chose to purchase 20 bags of chips and they happened to be overweight, whether they purchased an apple, true story, an apple and 4 cases of beer. Like, it just, yeah, there's judgments that happen all the time. But to have judgment in the place that is supposed to be your worship space, where you're supposed to be fulfilled, where you're supposed to seek a true relationship with God, that's not needed, that's not warranted, that's not helpful. And when you have to face that on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or a routine basis, why subject yourself to that? It's much easier to not go at that point. I remember in the Christian church, there would be people who would come specifically for Easter and Christmas. Those are the 2 main services, the 2 main holidays in Christianity. If you happen to come to a service on Christmas and Easter and you really didn't see them any other time of the year, maybe they weren't a part of your church, maybe they were, do you know that people had a name for them? They didn't know these individuals. They didn't know if they went to church somewhere else. They didn't know them, but they referred to them as Cheesters. Christmas and Easter, Cheester. And they would judge them like they were less than because they were only there for the high holidays. Again, you don't know where they are, but there is this inherent need to judge people, make yourself feel like you're more important, you're more valued in Christianity. And it's disheartening. And it's disgusting. Speaking for myself, when I chose to leave the Christian church, I had been quite active. I had taught Sunday school for over a quarter of a century. I had taught confirmation for, I think it was 5 years. I had been part of the choir for multiple years. I was there, I was active in my 40 years. When I chose to leave, nobody reached out. Nobody said anything. But what hurt the most, because I wasn't necessarily expecting them to reach out or say anything, but I will never forget. Again, I live in a small town. I was at the grocery store. I was at the grocery store just picking up normal groceries. And there was someone that I happened to know from choir at the church. And I hadn't seen them in a while. So I just said, "Hi, how are you doing?" They not only ignored me, they turned their head the other way and left the aisle so quickly that I literally stood there in the middle of the aisle thinking, do they have a hearing problem? Did I not speak loud enough? Were they so focused on what they were needing to get that they didn't hear me? And the more I thought about it, the more judged I felt. It was humiliating. Now, I happened to come across this person 2 more times before I could check out, and they did the same thing each time. I can tell you, by the 3rd time encountering them, I no longer reached out a greeting first. What was the purpose? What was the point? They very clearly did not want anything to do with me. I was no longer valuable to them. I didn't fill a service for them. And that hurt. Not that I needed validation in that person, but I had given a large portion of my life for 40 years to this institution, these group of people who I felt we were working together to do something, and I felt so completely dismissed. in that instant, I knew I didn't want to go back. There was nothing I desired to go back to that church. And that's sad because I was there for 40 years. They're not bad people, but I don't need that judgment. I don't need the turmoil within myself when they're talking about things that I don't believe in. I don't need to try to change their mind on things. I can wish them well and continue doing what's best for me by not going back to that church. So that's reason number one that I think people are leaving the church, the judgment that they face. The judgment that they face. The next one that we're going to talk about is changes in priorities. Families are busy, without a doubt. They are busy. When I was growing up, going to church was a cornerstone. You were doing nothing else on Sunday until you went to church. If you were too sick to go to church, well, you better not be planning on doing anything else for the rest of the day because nope, you're not getting to do anything else until you go to church. And it started to switch when people started to deprioritize church. They didn't see the benefit of it. Again, not judging, but there were people who didn't feel connected at church. They didn't believe in what was going on at church. They didn't want to be a part of it. So they would go hunting, or they would go to the grocery store, or they would say, I feel more connected when I'm taking a walk. I'm not here to judge you and what you do, but there were steady changes throughout my growing up in the Christian church. Changes that took the focus from church to other things. And it was a big switch when there started to be different sporting events, youth soccer and baseball and basketball and things like this, that was occurring on the weekends. They would have Saturday tournaments, then they would have Sunday tournaments. Well, if you're in a Sunday tournament, you can't go to church because it starts at 8. And it was a slow change. It was something that kids didn't feel a need to go to church. So if they're pushing back on their parents and saying, well, but I really want to go to this baseball tournament, then they'll go to the baseball tournament. The families didn't really want to go to church anyways. They were doing it because they wanted to continue what the previous families had always done. It was different. It was different. Growing up, there would be changes in priorities as far as you aged. So the common notion was that you went to Sunday school at least part of the time, and then you would be part of confirmation, a time where you focused more on learning about what do you really believe, what does the church believe, how does that dovetail together. And then historically, after you were confirmed, you didn't go to church for a while. You didn't. You kind of took that as your off time. You went and explored and you found different priorities for yourself. You were trying to find yourself. You might focus more on school. Maybe you got a job. Maybe you started dating somebody. Maybe you were going to explore different faith practices. Maybe you moved. That changing priority made the church that was once the center of lives now a second or fourth thought. You could always come back when or if you felt the need. But it wasn't like the church was going anywhere, so that did not need to be a high priority. And that consistent change just perpetuates that. The more you take something and discount it or devalue it and know that, oh, it's always going to be there, I'll come back to it when I have time. I'll come back to it when I have kids. I'll come back to it when I want to get married. I'm going to go and take time for me. That changes your focus. And slowly but surely, society has changed its focus. The focus is no longer on church. Now, there are some groups that their focus is very much on certain aspects. But I can say that even in those situations, there's been a change of priorities throughout their whole life and their whole society. It's different. But slowly, people are changing. They don't see the need or the value of going to church. Which brings me to my third point. My third point is that lack of connection. Growing up, church was a place where it was supposed to be like a second home. It was equivalent to going to grandma's house. It was where you were supposed to feel loved and surrounded in this nurturing environment of people who wished you well, who truly wanted the best for you and saw all the good within you. That didn't exist for long growing up. There were connections, but as I look back, the connections were very surface level. They were connections for a time and for a place. For example, when I started teaching Sunday school, I remember the first teacher that kind of assisted me through that first year. She was my co-teacher because I was young. I remember her. I remember having a close bond with her that year. The next year, she didn't teach. And I would still see her in service, but we did not have that connection. We didn't. When I would be a part of the choir, there would be friendly conversations that we would have. But if I couldn't be a part of the choir because of work commitments or whatever, those connections dissipated so quickly. Having those connections with the other people is what's supposed to hold you to the church when things get rough. The ultimate goal of the church is for you to form a connection with God or Jesus. But as you're working through different things, as you're having struggles and encountering them in life, there are times where you need to rely on only yourself and really pull it into yourself. It's much more of an individual thing, and at times it can be difficult to sit in a room filled with people and feel like you are grappling with this heavy burden and you feel incredibly alone because nobody else is dealing with it. Nobody else wants to deal with it. It's a you and God thing. You lose the support. You lose that feeling of, we're here for you. Even if we can't help your situation, we're here for you. It's very isolating. And unless you are willing to put in the time and energy, the prayers and the meditations and the reading, and really investing yourself into that relationship, you're going through the motions. And it's not going to be enough to sustain you. Not to sustain you in that relationship. Because you're going to continually face the changes of priorities within your life, within society. You're going to continually face the judgments. And when you don't have those connections with other people, and you don't have that connection with God or Jesus, it unravels you. it makes your life feel so frayed. Why would you go back? Why would you subject yourself to that? Sitting in a deer stand, you can do just as much introspective work as you can sitting in a pew. Now add in additional things, such as maybe you're a transgender individual. Maybe you're homosexual. Maybe you're a single mom. Maybe you are divorced. Maybe you're homeless. That adds a whole nother layer onto the judgment, onto the shifting priorities. If you're homeless, your top priority is not going to be to make it to choir. It's not. You've got to worry about your safety. You've got to worry about finding a place to sleep. You've got to worry about finding food to eat. You have other priorities. And if the church is not there to support that connection, if you have so many struggles that you're dealing with that you can't form that relationship with God, you can have the best of intentions, but it's going to slowly pull you away. Because that judgment from other people is real. I can remember being at the Christian church and having an individual come in that happened to be a trans individual. And people would talk about this individual behind their back. I believe this individual came a total of twice. The first time they came, they stayed around, they talked a little bit. We had a coffee hour, they called it, after worship, where you had cookies and juice and coffee, and you could just sit around and chat for a little while. They stayed around the first time. The second time, they beelined out of there. And people would talk about this individual with no shame, mercilessly, just tearing at their character. How could they be here? Aren't they embarrassed to be this individual? At the same time that this church in particular was preaching how they are all one and we are all created by God and we are all equal, and they are not walking the walk or talking the talk. It was all a facade. I can remember a couple that happened to be homosexuals coming to a Christmas program that the kids were having. And they held hands, as many couples do. And the outrage by some of the members of the congregation that they would dare display their tendencies in public. It's not welcoming. And at the same time, the church that I'm speaking of was what was known as open and affirming, which means they were saying, yes, we don't care who you are, who you love, how you live your life, you're welcomed here. But their actions were vastly different. It is not surprising at all to me that people are leaving the church in droves. There's so much that is going on in the world where people feel challenged and people feel no connection or limited connection. They feel like they're in this alone. And church is supposed to be a place where you're supposed to feel filled and you're supposed to feel that connection. And it's supposed to be a safe place. And in my experience, it's not. It's not. Now, I'm not saying that any church is terrible. Every church has its good points. But in general, judgment change in priorities, and lack of connection is driving people away. It is. Now, again, that's the Christian church. Do people from the Muslim culture experience things like this? I'm sure. Do people from the Jewish culture experience things like this? I'm sure. But maybe not to the same degree. In my experience as a Christian for over 40 years, the church can be a good thing and it can be a tough thing to deal with. And I think something needs to change, or you're going to continue to see people leaving the church because it doesn't have a purpose in their life. They can gain that fulfillment in other ways. So that's my thoughts, my impressions. They don't have to be yours. Just wanted to share them with you. Because the more we know, the more we grow. Until next time, bye-bye.